Holding the CBC to account, that is the topic of tonight's byline. People will say to me, Lilley, why do you talk about the CBC so much? Well, I do it because their hypocrisy just cries out. This is an organization that says it holds the government to account. Hey, good for them. Yet they're part of the state. They are the state broadcaster and they run on our dime. Do they do a good job with our cash? I'd argue no. But it can be tough to tell because so much of what they spend our money on is secret. In a moment, I'm going to show you some documents we received from CBC through Access to Information. The documents should show how much we're paying the auditing and consulting firm of Deloitte to do work at the state broadcaster. But they don't. In fact, they show very little. But first, some stories from CBC News on Access to Information. That's just from this week. Here's one. Red River College president expenses golf shoes license. I'd say that's a good story out of Winnipeg of public funds being misused. Here's another one. Liberals demanding bonus amounts paid to Tory bureaucrats. Now, in this story out of Newfoundland, CBC's complaining that they can't find out the exact bonuses paid to bureaucrats. They just get a range. Oh, how horrible. Funny, that's all CBC will provide to us when it comes to salary, bonuses, or perks for their senior executives, people like Hubie. Finally, CBC up in Nunavut, well, they found out an interesting story from the healthcare system. Here's the headline. Nunavut spends millions on temporary doctors. Now, what's really funny here is that CBC can get information on what's being paid to doctors. They complain about a lack of information from others, and yet they give us nothing when we ask about their contracts with Deloitte. I want you to take a look at this invoice. It's pretty indicative. They say they can't tell us anything about except the out-of-pocket expenses. This invoice has all kinds of line items on it for different work done by Deloitte, but they've taken those amounts out, they've taken the HST amount out, and they've taken the total out. It's bad when CBC doesn't get the info they want, but it's okay when they refuse to give out details on how our money is spent. The CBC will tell you that they're open. There's a new spirit of gladnost at the state broadcaster. Garbage. After losing in court, they've simply found new ways to block the release of information. But don't worry, CBC has standards. They are the gold standard, and Hubie will tell you that himself. He ran us down recently at a committee appearance saying that unlike CBC, his employees have standards. Really? Then why did a judge call your people parasitic sensationalists and blast you for a lack of standards? Why do you continue to run down and attack anyone that disagrees with your liberal, elitist, downtown point of view? About a month from now, the CBC's Fifth Estate, their flagship journalism program, we can expect to see a hatchet job on a businessman from Vancouver. His name is Russ George. You'll meet him shortly, but I want you to know a few facts about this first. Mr. George is working with the Haida First Nation near Vancouver to attempt to restore their salmon fishery. They use iron. They deposit it in the water in the ocean to stimulate plant growth, which they say will help bring back the salmon. They also say that this could help offset climate change. Now, those three things, working with First Nations, bringing back the salmon, and trying to deal with climate change, should get you good marks in CBC's books. Not Russ George. He's been attacked by some environmental groups and therefore by CBC. They've run dozens and dozens of stories on their various stations and platforms since last October. They are attack articles. They're not neutral, and they all have the right qualifiers, including they make sure they describe him as an American businessman. Mr. George has lived in Canada since 1971, but to CBC, he's just a foreigner. And if you thought they loved immigrants, well, no, only some kinds. This week, they surprised Mr. George by having a crew, including Fifth Estate host Gillian Finlay, hide behind cars and a garbage dumpster in the parking lot before swarming Mr. George as he attempted to enter his office. Demand answers, swarm, threaten. Are these the higher CBC standards? CBC is an organization out of control. They portray themselves as public defenders, but I'd say the public needs protected from CBC, not by CBC. These antics, their past, their refusal to come clean on how they spend our money, it's just more proof that Canada needs to sell the CBC. And that's the byline. You're about to travel to another dimension, a dimension of disbelief for eyes, ears, and mind. A journey through a terrifying land where apologists know no boundaries. Your next stop, the Liberal Zone.
I don't expect the Sun's agenda to change, but I believe it is important to call them out when they are deliberately misleading Canadians. Let me point out a few differences between CBC Radio-Canada and Québecor Media. CBC Radio-Canada has journalistic standards.
You know, I know a lot of CBC journalists, and I would say that, yeah, some of them do have standards, but it seems to be a personal thing and how they govern themselves. It doesn't go across the board, and I would say that that goes to the Fifth Estate as well and how they handle themselves. Joining me now is Russ George. He is the man, as I said, who will be profiled in the April 5th edition of the Fifth Estate, so just about a month from now. And Mr. George is in our Vancouver studio. Sir, you were, as I said earlier, you were ambushed this week by the CBC crew. Can you tell us what happened there? How were you ambushed? What were they doing?
Well, it was actually last Wednesday. I drove to work as normal. I work for a village-owned company called the Haida Salmon Restoration Corporation out here in British Columbia. And we'd talked to the CBC and they'd wanted to interview us. And we said, well, you know, let's have some terms and conditions of the interview. Tell us what the nature of the interview is and all of that. And they said, no terms. You have to talk to us without any conditions. And if you don't like what we do with your story, you can sue us.
So, honestly, that's what they said. If you don't like what we do, you can sue us?
Yeah, Ole Rumik, who's the producer for Fifth Estate, said to us very emphatically, you know, we have a right to do a story about you, and you have to do that. And if you don't give us an interview, you'll regret it. And conversations went on and on over several weeks, and finally he blurted out in one conversation. He says, well, if you don't like what we're going to do, what we do with your story, you can always sue us. So, you know, we'd in fact asked the we'd contacted the CBC ombudsman and said that Fifth Estate were bullying us and demanding this. And and we even met with them in our lawyer's office here in Vancouver months ago, trying to come up with some reasonable agreements of terms and conditions. So the saga went on, and then last Wednesday morning I was driving to work, and I pulled into the parking lot behind our office laboratory building here in Vancouver, and as I left my car and was sort of halfway to the office door, you know, up springs these people who'd been crouched behind cars and dumpsters or whatever, and they come rushing at me across the parking lot. And one of them is this tall blonde woman who I now know is CBC's, you know, Martha Stewart evil doppelganger, Gillian Findlay. And she's pressing very close to me as I'm turning the key in the office door. And I get the door open and she presses ever closer, and I just managed to slip in the door and breathed a sigh of relief. And I thought I was just fine and okay, got away from those guys. And then I looked down at my hand that was hurting and bleeding a little bit. And I said, oh, well, not all of me got in the door.
So you got your hand banged up a little bit. Now, CBC, there's a picture of your hand. CBC says, oh, no, our footage shows that it's fine. Because I asked them, I said, here's what this gentleman, Mr. George, tells me. What do you have to say? Is this how you operate? They said, oh, no, our footage shows that they acted just fine, including the whole issue of hiding behind cars and dumpsters. Let me read you
well,
a quote.
here's the hand. You know, I'm still taking the Band-Aid off right now. Still shows the wound there that's been infected. And if you feel along the edge of the bone there, you can feel the bone callus starting to form. That's representative of a little tiny minor break. Nothing major, right? Just a trivial bit of cut, you know, banged up flesh, a little bit of blood, and a minor broken bone.
Okay,
that's
so
CBC's view of normal.
I want to get in a couple more questions before we're out of time, Russ. And
sure.
One is, I'll read you the quote from Chuck Thompson, who's their head of media relations at English Services. And he said, regarding how they approached you for the interview, they said, in such cases, we first try to persuade the person to be interviewed. If he or she continues to refuse and we consider it essential to record his or her reaction to our questions, we may confront the person in person or by telephone and record his or her statements without obtaining consent. Do you think that that is an acceptable way to behave? I mean, journalists do this all the time. They go out there and they pop up as a politician's leaving a meeting and they say, hey, what's your thoughts on this? They'll quite often refuse. But I've never hidden behind a car and jumped out at somebody in an empty parking lot.
Well, sure, and I've been in the media for a lot, and I've faced media scrums before with media people. I've never been, you know, had media people crouched behind parked cars and behind objects, you know, and spring out unexpectedly and rush me. And I had no idea who they were. You know, a couple of months ago, a person sprang at me in our parking lot, you know, following the CBC As It Happens broadcast and attack on us. And that person sprang out and called me an eco-terrorist. So, you know, the very fact is I have some reason to be concerned that, you know, about safety, and these people knew it, right? And they
if
were
I can ask you one last, we're out of time now. I want to get in about
sure.
a 20-second answer if you can. I'll throw this at you. You are an immigrant to Canada. You are working on the environment. You are working with First Nations people. Normally that's a hat trick for CBC. Why do they dislike you so much?
Well, I don't know why. You know, like we're working with the village of Old Masset, the Haiduk village. We're trying to take care of their traditional ocean pasture at their expense. They've put up a couple of $1 million to do so. And we're trying to bring the ocean back to the state of health that the salmon can live there. And so and why the CBC would leap on us at this is, obviously it's part of an orchestrated campaign they have to fabricate this news story. Maybe it's a dull news cycle for them, right?
Thanks a lot for joining us, Mr. George. We'll chat again perhaps after the show airs.
Yeah, thank you very much for putting me on.
All right. And if you have any doubt that this will be anything but an attack on Rush George, well, check out this clip of CBC's promo for the show.
He's been called a geo-vigilante, an eco-terrorist. For years, American businessman Russ George has nurtured a radical idea: cure global warming by seeding the ocean.
Save the world, make a little money on the side.
But environmentalists are dead set against him. How did he get away with skirting international conventions, possibly Canadian law, to finally carry out his grand experiment off BC's coast?
Yeah, that looks like it's going to be a well-balanced piece. CBC at its finest. This is the reason I wrote the book, folks. Email me your thoughts, byline@sunmedia.ca.